Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 79 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Edmonton Oilers, in which the Sharks have lost 6-1. This being the second straight game in which the Sharks have given up 6 goals. It seems as though that strong stretch of games that they were playing a few days ago, where they won 3 in a row and then went into a pretty close overtime game against the Colorado Avalanche, has now come to an end, which is not really that much of a surprise. It's not as though the Sharks, 75 games into the season, suddenly became this really good team. It was just a decent stretch of hockey where they played relatively well, and the teams playing against them did not play particularly well. And so now going up against the real behemoths of the Western Conference, who are really putting sort of their best foot forward, or their best skate forward, I guess you could say, they end up losing it 6-2 to the Avalanche a couple days ago and 6-1 to the Oilers here tonight. Just kind of generally have had a really bad matchup versus the Oilers thus far this season. And this one starts off in this first period with the goal from Ryan Nugent-Hopkins to make it 1-0. The Sharks would tie it up with a goal from Tomas Hertl, but that would be the Sharks' only goal of the game, as McDavid would score his 63rd of the season. That is more than double any of the top Sharks scoring players on this team. So that just goes to show not only how amazing McDavid has been this season, but also how bad the Sharks have been this season. So it was 2-1 at the end of the first period. And honestly, the Sharks, they shouldn't be super embarrassed with their performance here tonight. Similar to the other night against the Colorado Avalanche, they played decently well. It's just that the Oilers completely outclassed them, completely outplayed them. They were just generally a much better team than the Sharks, as one of the best teams in the Pacific Division, one of the best teams in the Western Conference, while the Sharks are one of the worst teams in the Pacific Division and one of the worst teams in the Western Conference. In the second period, the Oilers would add 2 more goals to their repertoire, Hyman and Ryan, that one being shorthanded, to make it 4-1 Oilers at the end of the second period. In the third period is really where it did kind of start to get embarrassing. The Sharks just kind of looked extremely checked out in that third period. So while those first 2 were at least decently interesting to watch, the third period was rather forgettable. The Oilers would add a couple more goals for themselves, Broberg as well as McDavid with his 64th, and that would be the 6-1 loss for San Jose as we move into the final week of the NHL regular season here. Let us now talk about the standings, and I'm actually going to spend more time than usual on the standings because one thing got locked in with this regulation loss today, and that is that the San Jose Sharks can finish no better than 4th last in the league. The next closest team to them is the Arizona Coyotes with 67 points. Even if the Sharks were to win all 3 of their remaining games, they could only get up to 66. So indeed, the San Jose Sharks cannot drop any, or I guess cannot rise any higher than this 4th last spot. So they will have at the very least 9.5% odds at getting that first overall pick. Now, the major thing to discuss here is, can the Sharks fall down in the standings? Of course, that 3-game winning streak as well as the overtime loss to the Colorado Avalanche of just last week kind of threw a wrench into the San Jose Sharks draft lottery hopes. But not all hope is lost technically. As we take a look here, the San Jose Sharks at 60 points with 3 games remaining, as well as the Blackhawks, Blue Jackets, and Ducks at 56 points, with each of them having 4 games remaining, considering the Sharks played an early game here tonight. All 3 of these other teams are in action currently. In fact, the Ducks, I believe, are losing to the Arizona Coyotes. Now, the first major thing that we have to establish at this point is that the Sharks pretty much need to lose their last 3 games in regulation if they want to be able to drop any lower. Even a singular overtime loss would make this likely an insurmountable situation and would almost certainly lock in this 4th last spot. And so, if we take a look at the last 3 remaining games on the schedule for the San Jose Sharks, they face the Oilers in the final game of the season. Should likely be another big loss, considering the Sharks are having a lot of struggles with the Oilers this season. Their other 2 games, though, are against the Flames and the Jets. The Flames, they have lost a couple of games to them, even if a couple of them have been close, but their games against the Jets have gone their way thus far this season. They are 2-0 against Winnipeg. The sort of good news, I guess you could say, is that both the Jets and the Flames are fighting for a very, very tight, singular playoff spot in the Western Conference. So the Jets will certainly have a lot to play for in their upcoming game against the San Jose Sharks, which will be the Sharks' next game on Monday. So it is definitely possible that the Sharks go 0-3, all 3 in regulation for these final games of the season. But they will need some help from any of the teams below them if they want to drop any further in the standings. And this is where tiebreakers come in, because at best, most likely, we can only hope for any of these three teams to actually put up 4 points to tie the San Jose Sharks. And the tiebreaker, and as you'll notice by the added numbers to this, the tiebreaker to settle which teams finish in first, at least the first tiebreaker, is regulation wins. The San Jose Sharks currently sit at 16 regulation wins, and if we assume 3 regulation losses to end the year, that's what they will finish as. So the Blackhawks here in third last place already have more regulation wins than San Jose, meaning any which way that they get 4 points, whether that is through 2 regulation wins, 2 overtime wins, a regulation win and 2 overtime losses, 4 overtime losses, they will always have the tiebreaker over San Jose in this situation, meaning they just need to get 4 points. So that's definitely the Sharks' best hopes in falling to that third last spot. When it comes to the Blue Jackets, they'll need to do a bit more. They need to get at the very least 1 regulation win on their way to that 60-point mark in tying the San Jose Sharks, because that would at least bring them to the second tiebreaker, which is regulation and overtime wins, which the Blue Jackets have 23 of, while the Sharks only have 21 of. So if the Blue Jackets put up 4 points, as long as 2 of those points come in the form of a regulation win, the Sharks can also pass them. The major difficulty would be with the Anaheim Ducks. In pretty much every situation in which the Ducks get 4 points, actually in literally every situation in which the Ducks get 4 points and tie San Jose, they will not have the tiebreakers. So at this point, the Ducks either have to get at least 5 points in the remaining 4 games, which is going to be pretty much impossible. Otherwise, the Sharks will not be able to finish last place. So at this point, realistically, the Sharks are likely hoping at best to be second last in the league, which is still pretty good, but of course not those coveted first overall last place odds of 25.5%. So that is the story with the standings. Let us now move on quickly to the players to talk about from this game. The lineup was actually kept the same besides a change in goal, which was somewhat surprising after a 6-2 loss. We have the top line of Labanc, Couture, and Bordelot. I will say that this line was not good, at least through the first couple of periods of this game. What was quite interesting, at least when I'm going to talk about someone like Thomas Bordelot in this game, is that the Sharks, like I mentioned earlier, were relatively competitive through the first couple of periods of this game, still obviously getting outplayed, but not by that wide of a margin. It was really only in the third period where things definitely opened up and the Oilers were clearly significantly better. And when it comes to Bordelot's game, he actually somewhat struggled in those first couple of periods, and yet in the third I felt as though he was one of the Sharks' better forwards, one of the only forwards who was actually doing much of anything in that third period. So it was definitely quite the up and down game for Thomas Bordelot, but I'm honestly thinking the Sharks maybe should drop him down a bit in the lineup. Him playing on this top line, or at the very least in this top 6, is just not going great for San Jose at this point. When he's playing with Logan Couture, that means he's finding himself on the ice at times against a player like Connor McDavid, and you can't really expect much from that. If he's in the defensive zone defending against McDavid, it's not necessarily going to go well. So I think it would be much more interesting and helpful for Bordelot, like he had at the end of last season, to potentially get placed with someone like Nico Sturm and maybe a Noah Gregor or even a Fabian Zetterlund on that third line to see if that helps improve his game, which has been decidedly average over these last few outings. When it comes to the second line, this was probably the most effective line, I guess, at least in the early parts of this game. I definitely really liked Peterson's performance here tonight. He assisted on the Sharks' only goal of this game. Hertl scored the only goal of this game. But as has been the case with a lot of Tomas Hertl situations this year, is that he will start off well, but it doesn't necessarily finish. He doesn't necessarily have the confidence, especially when the Sharks are falling significantly far behind in a game, to really finish off a game very well. So I was happy with his first period performance. His second period performance was okay, but he was more or less invisible in that third period. So while I liked this duo once more, nothing else really came of it. And then when it comes to Noah Gregor, a second straight game where I wasn't super impressed with his performance, and I think he definitely should maybe also get moved back down to that third line. If a third line appears for the San Jose Sharks in the following game of Sturm, Gregor, and Bordelot, I think that would do some good things for them. When it comes to the actual third line here tonight of Sturm, Svechnikov, and Zetterlund, I will say the probably standout player on the third line was Zetterlund, which was a nice little change of pace considering he has frequently been the Sharks one of their worst performing forwards, even during that win streak, right? He was probably one of the least effective forwards while the Sharks were doing well. So the team actually have a pretty decent game here tonight. Not great, obviously. It was still a pretty bad third line in general for San Jose, but to be the shining piece on that pretty bad third line was, I guess, decently encouraging. And then it comes to this fourth line, which was probably the most put together line of the night, just generally over full 3 periods. Once more, this fourth line is continuing to do a lot of good things. Obviously, Steven Lorentz continues to stand out in a positive way, but I was also very happy once more with the performance of Jacob McDonald as a forward here for the third straight game. Usually when a team has to go with, 7 defensemen, they'll actually play their 7th defenseman as a defenseman. I believe the Oilers were running with 11 forwards here tonight and 7 defensemen, and they were actually rolling with 7 defensemen. But the Sharks are going in this direction, but are playing their 7th defenseman as a 12th forward instead. And the fact that they've done this for 3 straight games compared to just like 1 game in emergency tells me that they're very happy with how McDonald has worked on this forward line. Now, we do not exactly know whether or not McDonald heavily enjoys the forward role compared to the defensive role. I, of course, remember many years ago when Brent Burns first arrived in San Jose, the Sharks soon after tried him out in that forward role. It worked out quite well, but the big thing with his transition back to the defensive side of things is that he preferred playing defensive than playing in the top 6 of the forward lines. So it remains to be seen whether McDonald actually enjoys a 4th line role or a defensive role. Of course, when it comes to ice time, McDonald is playing significantly less on the 4th line than he does defensively, so that could definitely be a factor, but I have definitely enjoyed him as a forward thus far. He's played rather well. He doesn't have that same defensive liability to him when he's not relied on so much to be defensive. So if this is something that he would prefer to do, he could be a decent 4th line option for the San Jose Sharks moving forward for the last couple games of this season, but also potentially into next year, though realistically you probably go with a few better options. When it comes to the defensive side of things, obviously there were some issues defensively once more. First of all, Vlasic didn't even get to play much of this game at all, played about 2.5 minutes, would leave after the Nugent-Hopkins goal, as he kind of gets slew-footed, I would say, from behind by Zach Hyman in that situation, falls over quite awkwardly, exits the game. So the Sharks were running with 5 defensemen for the majority of it. Erik Karlsson ends up playing over 30 minutes of ice time here tonight, does not get a point on the singular goal that the San Jose Sharks score, so he remains at 98 with just 3 games remaining on the season. Still 100 very much in reach, but you don't want to cut it too close in that regard. Karlsson defensively obviously struggled, played a lot against Connor McDavid, and already Karlsson isn't really good at defense, so playing against the literal best player in the world going to kind of exacerbate that, so there were certainly some spotty plays. When it comes to the second pairing, if I continue to call him that, we have Shemek and Thrun, and the big thing that I want to talk about would be Henry Thrun, who ends up with about 22 minutes of ice time here tonight due to the injury of Marc-Edouard Vlasic, compared to Shemek, his defensive partner, at least his normal defensive partner, only had about 15 minutes, and the big thing with Thrun, actually, is that he was only one of 2 players who did not have a negative plus-minus on the game here tonight. The other player was Jacob McDonald on that 4th line, but the fact that Thrun played 22 minutes and was not on the ice for a single Oilers goal against is extremely impressive. Now, Thrun was somewhat sheltered. I would say that when it came to playing against player like Connor McDavid, it was frequently Benning, Ferraro, Erik Karlsson, even Shemek. Thrun didn't get too many shifts versus McDavid, but he did find himself on the ice a few times, and while there were a couple of moments where it didn't look great, though I'm not going to blame Thrun in any which way for that, because McDavid, like I've mentioned, is the best player in the world. He's going to make even the number 1 defensive defensemen in the league look absolutely silly at times, but I will say Thrun, a very nice game. The fact that he manages to keep that neutral rating on the plus-minus is very impressive in a game in which the Sharks gave up 6 goals, all of them, none of them on the power play, so they all had some sort of effect on the plus-minus, even though one of them was shorthanded, so Thrun is not going to be playing in a power play situation to get that, but still, nice performance from him. And then we have, of course, the goaltender James Reimer. He lets in 6 goals. I'm not even necessarily going to blame him for too many of these. A lot of them he just didn't really have that much of a chance on. The McDavid second goal was a breakaway. The first one he had very little chance on. The Nugent Hopkins one was difficult. So not really a terrible game from Reimer, but it's still a game in which he lets in 6 goals. So I also not great. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday, where they will take on the Winnipeg Jets, a team that they have beaten already twice this season, like I mentioned earlier. So we'll see if they can either keep their hopes of dropping in the standings alive, or if they will complete the season sweep and pretty much lock in that fourth last place spot. Class dismissed.